when he was a captain of the New York Provincials.
It was practically impassable.
Henry P. Walrath remembered, the army were marching through pieces of woods where the underbrush was very thick. The Indians rose and with a dreadful yell poured a destructive fire upon them.
General Herkimer built the road.
This is what the road looked like. This is a right-of-way near Erie Canal Village in Rome. You think you could hide a tank in there? Do you think you could hide Indians in there? Now, Nicholas Herkimer had called out the Tri-County militia and wanted to send 200 men to clear the road, the underbrush. Unfortunately, there was a power struggle going on, and the head of the Committee of Safety countermanded his order and put in play the situation which will become the Battle of Oriskany. Because if this had been cleared out, the Indians would have been much harder pressed. One of the interesting things we found was that a few days before the Battle of Oriskany, a tornado blew through the battlefield, tore down the hemlock trees. Hemlocks like wet. So anywhere there's wet on the side of hills, you'll find hemlocks. When they blow down, they pull up the roots. And when you read some of the accounts, they talk about men hiding in the roots of trees. Now this makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But these were pretty good sized trees. And interestingly, we had a forester come in from Syracuse University. And if you go just to the north of the battlefield, the ground has this undulating. And he goes, unbelievably, it's actually a relic of the Battle of Oriskany, where it blew down all the trees. This is actually going to help save Herkimer's force in the end. That's what a root looks like when it gets torn up. You now have a foxhole with cover. And the tree, remember two men behind a tree? Well, I think like this, it's like having a fortification. These are the leaders of the Crown forces. You have Joseph Brant. Joseph Brant is not a war chief. Joseph Brant is not a war chief. He will become a war chief from his actions this day. He is considered a very smart person, very highly regarded, but he's not a war chief. Sir John Johnson, the second Baron of New York. His father, Sir William, was a man of incredible importance to the crown throughout the French Indian Wars. He is probably one of the, I think he's the second richest man in America, in North America, including Canada. John Butler. John Butler is in the Indian Department. Interestingly, most historians talk about what a great job he did for the king. Well, I've been transcribing the Indian Department papers from Canada, and he basically was bankrupting the crown because he didn't follow the habits that Sir William had. Sir William, he dealt with the Indians, it was you do for me, I do for you. When he got to Niagara at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, he just started handing stuff out. So then all the Indians in Canada, beyond the Six Nations, said, hey, where are we? Chopped liver? So the king ended up giving huge amounts of materials, which cost huge amounts of money. It's absolutely unbelievable. Brigadier General Nicholas Herkimer. This is the only known image that supposedly looks like him. It was done about 40 years after he died, but people said it actually looks like him. I would thought the guy who played the man from U.N.C.L.E., I said he'd been perfect to have played Nicholas Herkimer. He has that look. On the evening of August 5th to 6th, Herkimer sends 3 scouts to Fort Sandwich to coordinate his plan. Now, interestingly, we kept 2 of the names, and it was that we remembered very well. We have John DeMuth, and we have John Adam Helmer. But the third was Hanyas Foltz. And it's Foltz family who kept a much more detailed story of them. He talks about how they crossed the north side of the river, that they had the letter in their hat, they swam across the river, they used a branch to hide, so they looked like a branch flowing down the river. And he also talks about how they ran into Sandwich, and he says, thank God the sentinel on guard duty was wide awake, because he threw open the picket gate, allowed us to dive in, and where we were diving in, literally the bullets were hitting where our heads had been, and one of their guns reportedly got hit by a bullet. Now, interestingly, if you go to Fort Sandwich, they have on display a gun lock. It is apparently for a Northwest trade gun. It was found about where the picket gate was. And if you go through, they found a butt plate, which was nailed on for a Northwest trade gun. And that was found in Bleeker's barracks in the cellar with a piece of an exploded shrapnel shell, or a mortar shell, touching it, which puts it the summer of 1778. Most likely they were all the guns the scout that lost his gun getting into Stanwix. Kind of makes for a really interesting story. Makes it come alive. Now, at about 5 o'clock the evening of August 5th, 2 warriors sent by Molly Brandt come in and tell the British at Oriskany, or the British down at the lower landing place, that there's an army at Oriskany of almost 1,000 men, actually about 760, which causes an absolute panic in the British camp because they had no idea anybody was anywhere near them. They sent out scouts to pick a spot. Old Smoke was the most senior of the war chiefs, 80 years old. He went out and helped pick a spot with Sir John Johnson where they were planning an ambush. Now we have to take a quick step back because there's agreement between Joseph Brandt and Nicholas Herkimer. The agreement was, so long as Nicholas Herkimer and his troops remained on this side of the Oriskany Creek, there'd be no war. Once he crossed the Rubicon, the creek, there was an act of war. Because these men were trying to keep the war from eating up the Mohawk Valley. They failed. This is the disposition of the troops just before the engagement. These are the wagons. There's 15 wagons. 3rd Battalion. This would be the 4th Battalion, 2nd Battalion, 1st Battalion, and the 4 Guard. Monument Road, Route 69, Oriskany Monument, DAR Monument. Does that give you an idea? Now, this is what a column of militia looked like. And this would be, you'd need about 8 times that number of men, to give you an idea of the number. And they were marching ward by 2, so it'd be actually twice as long. So you see how it goes on forever? And this gives you an idea kind of what they look like. These guys are farmers. Their officers are well dressed. So most of these guys are farmers, and they're going out knowing that, we're gonna be doing some hard work, and they're gonna be going out and stuff that's durable and comfortable. Which would have been like a linen smock with a linen shirt underneath. They're moving light and fast. Meanwhile, you have the Indians waiting for Herkimer's column, watching. It is said that just on the other side of the creek, there was a pile of brush, and one Indian was hiding in it. And when they crossed the river, after they had gone and passed, he ran and told Joseph Brant they're on their way, which actually makes sense because they had the agreement. And the Indians are waiting for the foreguard. There's one member of the foreguard who survived. He said he was looking into the woods, he all at once saw the Indians, he dove, and all hell broke loose. He was the only one to survive. Now, the Iroquois, when they fight, they always will make an oblique line. This is the road. Let's say this is a road. They'll make an oblique line moving so that they can encompass an enemy. They fell onto the foreguard. Now you have to realize this is happening in a matter of seconds. They are fallen on, they are dropped, they're attacked by men with slaughter weapons, tomahawks, killing sticks, spears, some muskets. There's probably 30 to 40 of them. One makes it out alive. Meanwhile, at the head of the 1st Battalion, Nicholas Herkimer is riding with Dr. Younglove. This is what happens to the foreguard. Within 3 minutes, they're dead, scalped, and the Indians are feeling a great victory. It should be remembered that a number of the Indian war chiefs had been raised just a few weeks before at Fort Oswego. So these are the young bucks. They're not the experienced warriors. When they hear the shooting, Nicholas Herkimer thinks the foreguard's just gotten trigger happy. So he tells Dr. Younglove, hop off your horse, stretch. He goes down the road a little bit. Next thing you see is Nicholas Herkimer riding hellbuck for leather, telling him, run. He didn't even have time to get on his horse. So they ran, and they followed back to a little higher ground. You see the 1st Battalion falling back, the Indians moving in. Now, if you were in that line of battle, if you're in Herkimer's column, it looks like the Indians are running down the side shooting. But what they're really doing is they're moving at a 90-degree angle, coming in. The furthest ones this way are the Mohawks. In fact, they really pissed off the commanding officer, the British, Sir John Johnson, because they moved their position before the battle to be in that furthest spot. So the 1st Battalion are all men. You have to remember, these are people who hunted. They hunt all the time. And these are men who know how to shoot. So they deploy across the road on a little higher ground. Now, what do you think happens when you have young Indian chiefs who just had this victory and think that there's blood in the air, what type of mistake would they make? They come charging down the road. And remember how you have a large number of men who know how to shoot now straight across the road? In the opening part of this, supposedly 13 chiefs were killed. They're all these young guys. The easy victory against the foreguard made them overconfident. So they charge down the road, looking something somewhat like this. Into a group of men shooting something like this. Meanwhile, the rest of the Indian forces are coming in on the flank. See how they're moving in? Now, how much time do you think has passed? Less than 10 minutes. It's already become a huge mess in less than 10 minutes. Everybody wonders where the Oneidas were. And the Oneidas always said they moved up to the front when the shooting started. Hanyuri had cousins that were the Doxiters. He's with his cousins. He's got his detachment, they're with the 4th Battalion. And they move up. One of the warriors, Henry Paulus, will earn his name the Buzzsaw this day. You know how he earns his name? He has 2 killing sticks, which are sticks with a knife stick sticking out of them at a 90-degree angle. And he runs between the grappling Indians and militiamen with his arms like this, breaking them up, and saves the lives of 8 militiamen. So he earns his name, the Buzzsaw. Hanyuri, the headman of the village of Oriskany, is a close personal friend of Nicholas Oriskany. They are very close friends. This is the white man he knows and understands and trusts. He is aided by his wife 2 kettles together. They're actually buried at the Oneida Indian Burial Ground. We actually found an 1850 deposition, and there was a militiaman still alive who went to both their funerals. Hanyuri will die on January 4th, 1838. His wife will die July 4th, 1838. His wife dies on July 3rd, 1844. So, Herkimer's expecting the rear to come up and reinforce the front. That's when Anthony Van Vetchen breaks and flees, causing a panic. He's seen running down the road yelling, "Leapin', youngin', leapin'. Run, young men, run." When you have militia and you see a fairly senior officer running down the road yelling, "Run for your life," it has a very bad effect on your troops. And what happens is the 2nd and 4th Battalion are turned into a panic mob. And they're fleeing down the road, where they bump into the wagons. And there they are, god-awful mess, right at the edge of the ravine. And meanwhile, what do you think the Mohawks are doing? They're still trying to get into the battle. They're just a panic mob. So, what does a general do when his troops break? What's his job? To rally them. So he goes from the head of the column, where the battle began, with the 1st Battalion, rides hell-bent for leather to catch up with his panicked troops to restore order. Colonel Fisher and Colonel Veeder tried to regroup them at the wagons with their swords drawn. They have actually sworn eyewitness testimony. There you see Herkimer going back, trying to rally his men. Remember, we're now about 12 minutes into the Battle of Oriskany and all this has happened. Do you see why it's a mess? By the way, you have another front opening in the rear. So the Mohawks strike the wagon train. There's 15 wagons in the wagon train. They left the rest of their wagons with a spare company back at Deerfield, which is now North Utica. And you have men fleeing. Do you see how you have men fleeing? The Indians like quick victories, they like scalps, they like prisoners. So they're going to go after the easy pickings. Now Herkimer is located and warned of a sniper. Tells the soldier, warns him, you best keep an eye on him. In the next instant, Herkimer shot just below the knee. William Smith, who's the soldier who warned Herkimer, goes and kills the sniper. Takes his hat, which his son hated because he made him wear it for a number of years. Tomahawks the guy and takes his powder horn. And there's the powder horn. Now James Clement died in 1774. Well, his brothers are officers in the Indian Department. And here's actually the narrative about it, including with all the nasty details. Especially how he was mad at his son because he lost a hat a couple of years later, even though it was kind of bloody. Now, last time we were able, this is from the pictorial history of the Revolutionary War. In 1844, that's a reviewing stand, that they had a polk rally, and the story goes that was where Herkimer was shot, and that when they dug the post, they found the skeleton of a horse. That was his horse. So it's probably very accurately the spot because 3 of the guys who helped carry Herkimer said that's a spot. And that's where he commanded after he was wounded. They carried him. The majority of the militia flees to the north and to the east. We're now less than 30 minutes into the battle, and Herkimer's lost 2/3 of his force just to panic, or were killed in the opening engagement. Wounded general was attended to by Dr. Younglove. Dr. Petrie was wounded and seated next to the general. Dr. Petrie was actually like a world-renowned physician. He apparently learned both Indian medicine, herbal medicine, surgery. He was all around truly a physician of his time, and actually a very good one. Herkimer's advisor to command. He says, I shall meet the enemy. Now this spot was marked as early as 1888. Somebody had taken a tomahawk and carved the face of a man into the tree that Herkimer sat under. We believe it was Hanieri because the Iroquois Indian have a history of making false face. So it was something that would have been culturally something he would have understood. So here comes the Colonel's Company of the King's Royal Regiment York is going to try to push into the defensive area, the defensive ring. You can see in green, they're marching up, hitting the 1st Battalion. And they are going to see fierce resistance. This gives you an idea what the King's Royal Regiment of York looked like at the time of the battle. News had been sent back by an Indian that Sir John was hard pressed. So what happened is they sent a reinforcement. There were 60 British regulars and 28 Jaeger riflemen assigned to Lieutenant Byrd at the lower landing place. And they were brought up. These are what Jaeger riflemen look like. They had short-barreled rifles. They were excellent soldiers. The King's Royal Regiment Yorks repelled, match hand to hand. Captain Lieutenant Watt and was captured, and Lieutenant Singleton was wounded. At the end of the battle, Captain Watt is taken back to the Oneida Indian village of Oriskany. To Henry Felling, he gave him, for doing that service, he gave him a watch, which a family held for a long time. When they left Oriskany on August 7th in the morning, they tucked him under the bridge, hearing that the British and Indians would come. And a few days later they did, and they thought Watt was killed. They found him alive and took him back to the main army. The famous thunderstorm. This thunderstorm came straight out of the west. He came in the direction of the attack, is literally how it's remembered. If you've ever shot flintlocks, they do not like water. It creates havoc. So basically they shut down most of the battle. And that allowed Herkimer to regroup. Now, the Seneca have long held that the Oneida, to save the militia, uses sacred turtle rattles to call forth the storm. And this is still an issue of contention in the Six Nations. They felt that the Oneida saved the militia by basically using magic, summoning the storm to give Herkimer time to reconsolidate his force. The militia rallies. Now, where they rally is literally, you know how there's a little, they call it in the 19th century the Little Ravine. I call it a swale that runs parallel to Route 69. That is where they rally. They pull everybody together and hold on for dear life. Remember how they have the blowdown? This gives you the idea of when you have two men behind, it's like a fort. And if you have another group behind them, it's like a fort on a fort. It makes it, Joseph Brant told his son-in-law, there was no way we'd ever get the militia out of there. The other thing is they had water, because there's a spring there, and you can still see the spring today. Now the Crown forces change out their troops. Colonel's company of the King's Royal Regiment of New York attempts to pull a trick of war and are repelled. Actually, that should be the Light Infantry Company. A survivor of the battle many years later noted the top of the hill was covered with our dead. He went looking for his brother. This is what LiDAR does. This is a digital elevation model. Route 69, Monument Road. The Oriskany, pull off for Oriskany Monument. There's the road. See the hills? There's lots of good things hiding in this sketch. What they do is they shoot a laser. Let me see if I got it in here. They shoot a laser from an airplane, and if it gets like 3 returns. One is like the top of the vegetation, one is like the middle of the vegetation, and one is the ground surface. And this is what's the DM. And here I point out all the different things. See the hill to the west? And the top of the hill is covered with our dead. You see, Herkimer wanted to keep his feet dry because they're going to be pulling stuff like cannons over this road, or they're going to be bringing it. So you don't want to be where it's wet. Lieutenant Colonel John Butler is the head of the Indian Department of Six Nations. And he sees an opportunity. He's a good officer. He sees a resource, a way of possibly breaking the stalemate. He had the light infantrymen trade their Army of Canada caps, these, which all the troops in Canada were ordered to wear these. They cut down the hat so that they all look the same, and there's a whole bunch that went into it. But they had all these dead guys' hats on the top of that hill out of sight of the Americans. So they just traded for the hats of the guys who'd been scalped. And this gives you an idea of what they would have looked like when they attempted to break into the militia's defensive perimeter. Now, interestingly, that whole story gets mixed up because it's known, but Captain Gardenier, who receives the attack, is the one who clarifies exactly what happened. They knew that they did a trick of war and they thought they turned their coats inside out. That does not appear to be the case. He says they changed hats. Because his lieutenant says, "Stop, you're shooting at our men." He said, "The hell with that." He goes, "Forget the hats, look at the coats. Shoot on, boys, shoot on." Now this is all happening. Now this is probably the most accurate sketch of the Battle of Oriskany. If you change the hat to the Canadian cap, it's actually pretty accurate. See Herkimer sitting by the tree? See how the land's shaped? And notice how wide open it is? Because they had opened a 100-foot road. The only thing is there's been a lot more brush along the sides. After the perilous journey, the 3 scouts get into Fort Sandwich and take their message to Colonel Ganswort. In accordance with Herkimer's Lord Ganswort, 3 cannon shots were fired, so they knew that the message was received. Now, a few years ago, they attempted to see if you could actually hear a cannon from Fort Stanwix by shooting some cannons at Fort Stanwix and listening from a risky battlefield, and they weren't able to. The problem is, actually, there's 2 problems. It's a science problem. First of all, the National Park Service usually uses 3 to 9 ounces of powder, depending on the size of the gun. A standard charge of powder for an 18th century cannon is 1/3 the weight of the cannonball. So a 9-pound cannon shoots 3 pounds of gunpowder, not 9 ounces. A 6-pound cannon shoots 2 pounds of gunpowder, not 6 ounces. And a 3-pound cannon shoots 1 pound of gunpowder, not 3 ounces. That's problem number 1. Number 2, there's a second problem. At least for the 6 and the 9-pounders, we know that their balls go supersonic, creating a sound barrier. They break the sound barrier, and it causes a crack, which is very loud. Like, you ever hear a jet break the sound barrier? So that was the problem with that experiment, was that you had to hit the cannonball and use the right amount of powder, because in the fort they could hear the musketry. They note that there's the soldiers who say they can hear the musketry in the fort. So if you can hear the musketry, you will hear the cannons. This gives you an idea where everything's happening in a big picture. You have Fort St. Luke's there, the ruins of Fort Craven. That's very important, because there's going to be a little battle there. There's where the lower landing place is. Lower landing place is where the British are encamped. Now, interestingly, remember that they have brought flags. At the farthest point, they have the king's color, which is for the expedition. And at the farthest point, they have that flag posted. You know why? So that any loyalists who are coming up the valley know that they have reached the safety of the king's army and that they'd be welcome. Sir John Johnson had been told in 1776 that the king expected him to raise his regiment on his own expense, just like they did in 1745 when they had the uprising with the Highlanders, and that the way his family would be looked at in the future was based upon the zeal he showed. So you're the second wealthiest man in North America, and the king's person's just told you that how he's going to look at your family in the future is based upon what you're going to do. You're going to pop all the stops out. So he had a set of colors made at his expense. He's the second richest man. Think of it like a person like Donald Trump. You know how people have egos? You know that he has his ego. And we know he has a lot of ego, by the way. So that's all down here at the lower landing place. There's also 2 Indian commissioners with them. You see, they sent Daniel Klaus from England. They sent him, and then they had John Butler, both Indian Department superintendents. Each of those men would have had a flag because they're somewhere between an ambassador and a general. They help control the Indians. They have an interesting job. It just details where it is. And that is the route of Willett Sortie. He comes out of the fort. Interestingly, about 40 years ago, there was like a second-rate book on forts in America, and both me and a friend of mine, who was a great researcher, we read it, and we should have looked at the footnote, because it had the journal of Lieutenant Byrd. And I always remembered it because of something he said. He talks about how he has just come back from Oriskany and has the letters of the garrison, and he's opening them, sitting cross-legged in the marquee tent. And he hears a strange noise, and he looks up, and he says, he has troops pouring out of the fort, and Marinus Willet's heading straight at him with a spear. And how he dives out of the marquee tent and swims across the Mohawk River. And we have that story from several Americans saying they thought it was Sir John Johnson. What I always liked was his little note afterwards. He says, and he goes, Marinus Willett is such a bumpkin that he doesn't know the difference between a British lieutenant colonel and a British lieutenant. So he goes over, he goes up to the British camp, and they pull together a force of the regulars. This would give you some idea of what the guys from New England look like. That's the summer dress of the Continental Army. Interestingly, Gansworth's regiment would not receive rifle shirts until the Indian campaign of 1779. His men either had the black sleeved waistcoats with the buckskin breeches, or they were wearing their British regimentals, which had been dyed brown, that were captured by John Paul Jones and purloined by the New York Committee as they passed through New York. There's a whole backstory to that. It gets quite interesting. But there you can see Fort Craven, and what was mounded dirt, make a pretty good little fort. It was originally going to be built up into a fort. They just rebuilt Stanwicks and stripped it of pretty much all the wood and such. You can see the road. Here is the Fleury 1778 map of the Siege of Fort Stanwicks. You've probably seen this before. And there's the Battle of Sortie. That was a forward point, like for the guards. Literally, they were run over by Willet's troops because, well, there were 208 of them, and they were fighting mad and ready to go. They were all volunteers. They said the whole garrison volunteered to go. They picked out the 208 best men. And this would have been pretty much what the 38th Regiment footmen looked like from the British side. King's 8th, the thing is they would have had the funky hats, because the whole British Army in Canada had them. You just couldn't find a good picture. And this would be about a quarter of the number of soldiers that the British had. So it gives you an idea. Does it give you an idea it's a pretty big and well-trained force? They received Willett went out with 206. Then they brought out a small field gun, 3-pounder, with extra 50 men. And they took on those companies. Now, when Willett captured all the Indian goods, the Seneca say that when he captured their medicine pouches, they lost their will to fight at Oriskany. He had taken their mojo from them, and he now had their mojo, and they will give him a name. You know what his name is? The Blue Devil. About 3 p.m., the Crown forces, en masse, disengage. There's still Indians sulking, keeping them kind of bottled up, but the main majority are heading back because they know they just got attacked in the rear. About 3:15, remember how they left 30 guys back at what was North Utica today, Deerfield back then? They came at the run. And when they showed up, the idiots said, "The hell with this, reinforcements come in, we're out of here." 30 fresh reinforcements, we're out of here. About 4 p.m., the British returned to the lower landing. Now, the main body of the Tri-County Militia withdrew to Old Fort Schuyler, and they sent down for boats to help evacuate the wounded. Our rear guard was left at Oriskany that night. And in the night, the Oneidas sent warriors out looking for wounded and carried them back on their backs. Herkimer surrendered command before at Oriskany. He turned over command, he's wounded, they're evacuating him, and there's some debate as to which colonel took over command, but he left them in charge on the field. The war parties were returning with their prisoners. Now, from what we can gather, there were 16 prisoners. It's all the prisoners that were taken. The rest were killed. We know that the number killed and wounded when all was said and done on the American side was 160. There is an account from Fort Dayton. Two brothers heard when they called the roll at Fort Dayton that 341 men were missing. What Herkimer did is he sent his officers, because usually your captain would have done it, but so many of the captains were dead, he was the commanding officer of the companies, back to their home beats, the area where they lived, to take an accounting. And they found a number of the men just ran home. So that 340 number shrinks down to 160. That is reported up the line on the 12th of August. It's reported to George Washington, and it's reported to all of the surrounding district commanders by Philip Schuyler. Many years after the battle, Mr. Yates was a member of the committee, noted in his History of the United States in pencil that that day we lost 144 men. So 16 prisoners, 144, it's pretty close. A number of them were made to run the gauntlet. Something happened, and it's unclear. On the morning of August 7th, they saw something. They thought what was happening was an Indian ritual where they would put pine splinters under your skin and light them and turn you into a human candle. And that is one of the things that Willett believed he witnessed. This is kind of one of the saddest parts of the story. 30 years later, a gentleman was on the road, bumps into this guy who was supposedly killed in the Battle of Oriskany. He'd been a prisoner of war for 30 years held by the Indians. So they tried to get his family together. Eventually they did get him back. But here it is 30 years later. They put out, like in the newspaper, if you see this guy, take him into custody, his family will take care of it. You please do this. The Oriskany battlefield is a god-awful mess. We know that somewhere after the 6th of August, there was an effort to do burials. We now know that there were burials done between 1775 and 1780. That was a project done by the Rome Lab using advanced sensor technologies. They located 140 intact burials. However, the ground was still covered with hundreds of skeletons. And how that works out, we're not quite sure. My suspicion is, if you remember, I spoke that the King's Royal Regiment had 380 men the morning of August 6th. That a number of them were not regulars, but were loyalists attached. And that those are the men that are laying out there. I believe that they buried the militiamen as best they could identify and left the rest to rot out of anger. We do know one man who buried his son, because he talks to the Hessian, and as Hessian hears him saying, "There's my son, the dirty dog," as he's digging his grave. This is a story, and the Masons in the 1790s came together trying to give peace, dug a very large trench, and buried all the debris of war, hoping to bring peace, because the area is known to be haunted. In fact, the scouts from Fort Stanwix, so the messengers, would run as hard as they could till they got to the hill of Oriskany. When they'd usually sit on a skull, catch your breath because no Indian would ever go there. It was that haunted. And we located it, and we're gonna be looking, we're in the process of looking at that site. That's it. What questions do folks have? Is it a lot different than what you thought?
First, can we get a round of hand, or
Go ahead.
So how many British are there at the
Actually, I did a short paper on that. The morning of the 6th of August, the King's Royal Regiment had 380 men, 20 Rangers, 610, if I remember right, Six Nation warriors. So Herkimer is outgunned, which is what was said in our histories, our oral history, but this is actually what's reported to George Washington as an official report from the commanding general of the Army of the North. So this is intelligence. One of the things, anybody who researches the Revolutionary War, all intelligence goes to the commander-in-chief. So you look through and they've been publishing the Washington papers, they'll be publishing for another 50 years. But you can go online and find the letters to him, and you have to scroll through, and you'll find, we found letters from Cherry Valley that had information we've never seen before. So it's very important, you look.
Why don't you reposition?
I had seen reports.
You want to reposition?
Mentioned
Okay.
Canada.
Okay.
There were like 350 or 60 of the Herkimer's men that were killed. But you said that was kind of because some of them ran away and they just figured they were dead.
Yep.
So
See-
it's really more like 150 you said or less?
100, there were 144 killed and 16 captured.
Okay.
And that number is actually pretty tight. We actually found recently the expense book of the Indian Department for this campaign, and it has how much they paid for ransoming prisoners of war, and it's about right for 16 men.
So how many of the British? How many British died?
Well, that's a good question, because when you look, there were 32 of the Six Nations, but Herkimer sees 50 dead Indians from where he's sitting. My belief is a lot of those Indians are what you call the blue-eyed Iroquois. Those are white people pretending to be Indians, because if it all goes bad for them, they can wash off the Indian paint and go home. And that was something that happened quite often in the Revolutionary War. And I think a lot of them, they talk about how that some of the Indians shot into the back of the regulars, the King's Royal Regiment of New York, the uniformed troops. And many years later, the Seneca who was there said, it didn't happen. All our guys were sober. None of them were drunk Indians. I said, however, I think that you had a bunch of drunk people dressed up like Indians, and they were the ones who did this.
So it's crazy to me how the historical record is so wrong. As far as, the summary I see is Herkimer had 800 troops, one of the bloodiest battles, half of his troops died, 400, so it gets this 400 number somewhere. And that's continuous, it seems like, to be the narrative.
Well,
The historical
and-
record
and-
doesn't get corrected.
And it's one of the things is, and these guys were present. There's two, one of the things we find out is there's two accountings. At Fort Dayton, they called the rolls. There's 341 or 342 men. Two brothers remembered the exact number, and they were within one of each other, and they gave their disposition. And that is exactly what they heard, okay? However, Herkimer, who's in command, right? He has the officers go home, and a lot of these guys just ran home. So it's like, actually, I'm glad they ran home. I would probably been among them in all fairness. These were It was a horrible, horrible thing that happened. So what happened is, the story gets remembered, and remember, there were 760. There's actually a poem by Marinus Willett written on December 7th, 1777, Herkimer's Battle. And he sent down to pull together the information on the militia. He acts as an officer extraordinaire to Nicholas Herkimer. So he's helping collect, count, do all that type of stuff, because he's got to go and send for help. He's been sent to get help. He needs to tell the status of the militia to General Schuyler so they can try to find help to send up.
The other thing you'll see is them conflating deaths and injuries into a general casualty number.
Yeah, there's a lot of guys who have buckshot in their backside. There's a lot of wounded.
Okay, about the three signals, was also mentioned too, was, Herkimer's men were supposed to wait for three signals before they were told on the morning of August 6th. But Colonel Cox, he was pretty cocky that morning because he and Herkimer had bad blood.
It's actually a lot more complicated. Colonel Cox commanded a quarter of the Tri-County militia in the winter of 1776 to 1777, when they were called out and sent to Fort Independence, which is now in Vermont. It's right across from Fort Ticonderoga. So he had experienced independent command. You can get some idea of how Herkimer's troops were, because in that spring there was a general muster of the militia. And Herkimer wanted the troops to demonstrate what they had learned while they were up with the New England troops up on the lake. So he had a soldier who was up there who was his flugelman, which means goes through the manual of arms showing how they learned what they learned, who immediately steps out, begins doing the manual of arms, and bayonets himself in the foot right in front of him. And I always could just picture Nicholas Herkimer with his pipe just flopping down and thinking, and this is what I got to work with. Well, it gives you an idea of the type of people. They're very human. And the thing is, if I had been through what happens at Oriskany, I would remember what happened at Fort Dayton, but I do not have access to the command, what the commander's hearing, because Herkimer was a smart guy. He understood his troops. There were about 160 in the end who stood firm with him. The rest either died or scattered.
Sort of answering his question, having worked with Joseph for years and still don't know anything compared to him because he is the encyclopedia. But he's a great researcher. And one of the things to be pointed out in all of this is that back when they wrote those reports and back when they transmitted all their messages, they didn't have the advantage of the computer or cell phones or the research ability. He's a superb researcher and pulls up stuff. I actually only one time can point to something I gave to him and he says, oh, that's important. That's once out of years.
And there is stuff out there still. One of the things we found out, you know what happened after all this? After they broke off, Iowa Officer William Johnson went with his regiment down Lake Champlain. They sent him to Seneca country to do the funerary because the Senecas were ready to throw in the towel. And it's like, I didn't realize that. So we're constantly learning more and more about this as a whole. And it's one of the things it's like I said, if I was in the bar, I'd be telling you 340 and it's in the oral history. However, the commanding generals who actually know what's going on, and it's not, and one of the things is, you see it goes from, we know it's communicated to Schuyler, he sends it to Washington, because remember, all intelligence goes to the commander-in-chief. He sends it to the Eastern District, which is New England, commanding officer. He sends it to the Highlands, because these are separate commands. And he's telling everybody this is what's going on, so they can make adjustments, and they do make adjustments. the Highland, they released the 2nd and 4th New York Regiment to come to the aid of the Army of the North. There's just lots going on. But it's one of the things, like I said, the one who impressed me the most was he was a member of the Provincial Congress, Yates, and in his history, he has as a note. And I believe that is the most accurate. Anybody know Jim Morrison, the late Jim Morrison? He was a terrific researcher. He goes, as far as I can see, that is exactly the right numbers. Because he says you can't find, it's like you can't find more claims or bodies or anything. It's like, it made sense. But a lot of these guys ran home and it's like,
How many did they start out with exactly?
760, and then they were,
And that's like-
then the 40 Oneidas joined them at Oriskany here.
And how many United were killed, do you know?
We don't know.
So the 160 is not United, it's just for community people, you think?
The Oneidas said a lot of men were killed during the Revolutionary War. I don't know how many in that engagement.
So are there any names on the monument that didn't die, that were recorded as deaths but didn't die?
There's a number of names on the monument that didn't die. That you served in the Battle of Oriskany gets you on the monument. If you notice, a number of them there's like killed in action or wounded, but that's not all. 760 was the number. Now you have to remember, one of the things is originally Herkimer's brigade had 1,000 men, but there were several issues that came up. When they came up, the 1st Battalion rode up on horses. Well, people don't think about this, but horses eat food. Horses eat, I think it's somewhere between 5 and 12 pounds of food a day. So when you have 200 horses, that's a whole bunch of wagons of food you need just for the horses. And they were supposed to be infantry. So they sent 60 guys back with the horses. So you now went from 200 to 140. He had 30 men going after the caste women. They would keep the Six Nations in the war after Oriskany. These were white women that spoke the language. They lived down in what's today Schuyler. They were very, and they're heroes in Canada. So there goes a company. He had 40 men going along Schuyler Lake. He lost one company because they defected to the enemy. They show up at Fort Stanwix about a week and a half late after the battle. So it's like he's losing men here, there, everywhere, and he has to leave men to guard the women in the forts. And, to be fair, the slaves. 1/10 of the population of Tryon County is black slaves. And he either has to take them with him, and that could be, in reality, some of the bodies out there. I don't have where he took up the slaves, but it is required in the militia law that you either leave guards or you take them with you. And you could imagine the horror of that. You're in the middle of this, and you're just trying to survive. You're a slave just trying to survive. That would be like the most horrible thing I could imagine. You just don't want to be there at all. But it's a real possibility.
Is there any evidence that any of the bloodshed actually made it as far back as, say, this location?
Oh yeah. In fact, there. This is where the village of Oriskany. This side of the creek, Honieri's house was located behind where Trinkus Manor was. Most likely, that's where Herkimer had his command post the morning of August 6th when he had all that discussion and they had the big fight. There's talk that they see skeletons all the way back to almost Whitesboro. How accurate that is, it's a 1783, and there's a problem with geography in some of the stuff he says. This is called Oriskany Hill, Oriskany Hill. I don't know how to pull that together because he says the battle spot on Oriskany Hill, and this guy is taking the word of the peace to Canada. So I don't know what to make, or if he just, sometimes people scramble their notes. I can't tell you, but there is stories that yes. They go quite a distance.
You said about Hanier and two cows together were buried at their Oneida burial
Indian
ground.
burial
Where
ground.
is that?
That is located off of Marble Hill Road.
Okay, Cheryl?
Yep, and literally, I have friends that are Oneidas, I'm gonna suggest it again to them. I said, they made that beautiful statue and everything down at Rome, which if you haven't been there, you gotta go see it for the Oneida Carry. I said, I really think that they should have a bronze Hanieri and two cows together looking over the Oneida lands and over the burial ground, because they really are, Hanieri serves the United States government throughout his life. His two of his three sons die in the service of the United States government in 1812, during the War of 1812. One dies of camp fever, the other one's killed in the Battle of Chippewa. He's always known as a gentleman. The New Jersey men call him the White Indian, because he's very refined, a very interesting man. And it's like Hugh White gets a hazing from him when he moves up here, and it's fascinating because the White family may well still have the Indian dress that his wife made for Hugh White's granddaughter in 1784. From discussions I had with a member of the White family, I've been trying to get where this guy knew all the stories, and I mean, they have more stories of him and Hanieri, and it's a beautiful story that should be recorded so it's not lost. And his mother is the last of the descendant daughters of Hugh White, so she's the last Oneida. She's the last of the White family that's in Oneida. So it's like, I love them. It's a fascinating story. They should.
And it's a marked grave there. It's the graves.
No, there's no marked grave. There is an area where there is their burying ground.
Okay.
Alright, I think Joe will be available for a few more questions afterwards. I know these chairs aren't the most comfortable, so we'll wrap up. Thank everybody for being here today. If there's things that you're looking for afterwards, don't hesitate to send an email here, and we'll either get you in touch with some of the resources talked about, or I'll forward you on to Joe. And again, thank you, Joe, for being here today.
Alexis, can you tell us about August 5th?